The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. It was Christmas Eve. Marie and Fritz sat cuddled together in a corner of the back parlour, for they had not been permitted during the whole day to go even into the small drawing room, much less into the best drawing room into which it opened. The deep evening twilight had come, and they began to feel almost afraid. Seeing that no Christmas candles were brought in, Fritz whispered to his sister Marie, who was just 7, that he had heard rattlings and rustlings going on all day in the closed room, as well as distant hammerings, and that not long before, a little dark-looking man with a big box under his arm had gone slipping and creeping across the floor. He well knew that this little man was no other than Godfather Drosselmeyer. At this news, Marie clapped her little hands for gladness and cried, "Oh, I do wonder what pretty things Godfather Drosselmeyer has been making for us this time." Godfather Drosselmeyer was anything but a nice-looking man. He was little and lean, with a great many wrinkles on his face and a big patch of black plaster over his right eye, and not a hair on his head. He wore a fine white wig made of glass, but he was a very, very clever man, for he knew and understood all about clocks and watches, and could make them himself. So, when one of the beautiful clocks in Fritz and Marie's home was out of sorts and couldn't sing, Godfather Drosselmeyer would come, take off his glass periwig and his little yellow coat, put on a blue apron and begin to stick sharp-pointed instruments into the inside of the clock. Of course, whenever he came, he always brought something delightful in his pockets for Marie and Fritz. Perhaps a little man who could roll his eyes and make bows and scrapes most comic to behold, or a box out of which a little bird would jump. But for Christmas time, he had invariably prepared some especially wonderful invention. "Oh, what can Godfather Drosselmeyer have been making for us this time?" Marie said again. "I'm sure this time," said Fritz, "it must be a great castle, a fortress, where all sorts of pretty soldiers are drilling and marching about. Then other soldiers come to try and get into the fortress, upon which the soldiers inside fire away at them with cannon, until everything bangs and thunders like anything." "No, no," said Marie. "Godfather Drosselmeyer once told me about a beautiful garden with a lake in it, and beautiful swans swimming about with great gold collars, singing lovely music, and then a lovely little girl comes down through the garden to the lake, and calls the swans, and feeds them with shortbread and cake." "Swans don't eat cake and shortbread," Fritz cried, "and Godfather Drosselmeyer couldn't make a whole garden." The children went on trying to guess what he might have in store for them this time. Marie told Fritz that her biggest doll had altered very much. She was more clumsy and awkward than ever, for she tumbled onto the floor every 2 or 3 minutes. Fritz said that a good fox was lacking in his collection of animals, and that his army of soldiers was quite without a cavalry, as his papa well knew. But the children knew that their elders had all sorts of charming things ready for them. They remembered, too, that the Christ-child at Christmas time took special care of their wants, and knew best what gift would bring them true happiness. Marie sat in thoughtful silence, but Fritz murmured quietly to himself, "But for all that, I do want a fox and some hussars." It was now quite dark. Fritz and Marie, sitting close together, did not dare to utter another word. They felt as if there were a fluttering of gentle, unseen wings around them, while a very far-away music could be heard. Then a bright gleam of light passed quickly across the wall, and the children knew that the Christ child was being borne away on shining clouds to other happy children. At this moment a silvery bell rang out, cling-a-ling-a-cling-a-ling. The doors flew open, and a brilliant light came streaming from the drawing-room. "Oh, oh!" cried the children, clapping their hands. But Papa and Mamma came and took their hands, saying, "Come now, darlings, and see what the blessed Christ child has brought for you." The two children stood speechless, with brilliant glances fixed on all the beautiful things before them. After a while, Marie, with a sigh, cried, "Oh, how lovely! How lovely!" And Fritz gave several jumps of delight. The children had certainly been very, very good, for never had so many beautiful and delightful things been provided for them as at this Christmas. The great Christmas tree on the table bore many apples of silver and gold, and all its branches were heavy with bourdon blossom, consisting of sugar almonds, many tinted bonbons, and all sorts of charming things to eat. In all the recesses of its branches, hundreds of little tapers glittered like stars. How many beautiful things there were! Marie gazed at the loveliest dolls and all kinds of toys, and a little silk dress with many tinted ribbons hung from a projecting branch. "Oh, the lovely, lovely dress!" she cried. Fritz, in the meantime, had had 2 or 3 trials around the table to see how his new fox could gallop. "I believe it's a wild beast," he said, "but that's no matter. I can frighten him already." He set to work to muster his new hussars, well equipped in red and gold uniforms with real silver swords, and mounted on such shining white horses that you would have thought them of pure silver. When the children had become a little quieter, there came another tinkling of a bell, and they knew that Godfather Drosselmeyer would show them his Christmas presents, which were on another table against the wall, concealed by a curtain. When this curtain was drawn, what did the children behold? On a green lawn, bright with flowers, stood a beautiful castle with a great many shining windows and golden towers. A chime of bells was going on inside it, doors and windows opened, and you saw very small ladies and gentlemen with plumed hats and long robes walking up and down in the rooms. Fritz stood looking at the beautiful castle, his arms leaning upon the table. In a little while he said, "Godfather Drosselmeyer, let me go into your castle." "This cannot be done, little Fritz," was his answer. "The castle is not as tall as yourself, golden towers and all." "Well, then make the man with the green cloak, who is always looking from the window, walk about with the others." "And that can't be done either," said his godfather once more. "It can't be altered, you know." "Oh," said Fritz, "it can't be done? Very well, if your little creatures in the castle can only always do the same thing, they're not very much." So he went back to his Christmas table to play with his hussars. Marie, too, was soon tired of the little castle people, though she did not like to show it as her brother did. At last, however, she also crept back to the table where the Christmas presents were laid out, but she had just noticed there among Fritz's soldiers an excellent little man, standing still and modest as if he were waiting patiently until someone should notice him. In regard to his appearance, there was much that was objectionable, for his body was rather too tall and stout for his little thin legs, and his head was a great deal too large. But the elegance of the little gentleman's costume showed him to be a person of taste and cultivation. He had on a very pretty violet hussar's jacket, and the loveliest little boots ever seen. It was certainly funny that, dressed in such style as he was, he wore a rather absurd short cloak on his shoulders, which looked as if it were made of wood, and on his head he wore a miner's cap. Nevertheless, as Marie kept looking at this little man, she saw more and more clearly what a sweet disposition was legible on his countenance. His green eyes spoke only kindness, and the nicely curled white cotton beard on his chin drew attention to the sweet smile which his bright lips always expressed.
"Oh, Papa, dear!"
cried Marie at last.
"Whose is that most darling little man beside the tree?"
"That little fellow, my dear, will work hard for you all. He's going to crack nuts for you." With that, Marie's father took him from the table, and when he raised the wooden cloak, the little man opened his mouth. Marie put in a nut, and with a crack, the little man bit it in pieces. He had to crack a great many nuts. Marie picked out the smallest ones, but Fritz gave him all the biggest and hardest nuts he could find. But all at once there was a crack, crack, and 3 little teeth fell out of Nutcracker's mouth, and his chin became loose and shaky.
"Ah, my poor Nutcracker!"
Marie cried as she gathered up the lost teeth, bound a pretty white ribbon about his poor chin, and wrapped the poor little fellow tenderly in her handkerchief. In this way she held him, rocking him like a child in her arms, as she looked at her picture books. Marie and Fritz were allowed to keep their playthings in the glass cupboard in the sitting room. Fritz soon tired of playing with his hussars and placed them on the upper shelf, and Marie put her dolls in the beautiful dolls' room on the lower shelf. It had become almost midnight, and their mother had aroused the children to go to bed. Fritz obeyed, but Marie begged for just a little while longer, saying she had such a number of things to see to, and promising that as soon as ever she had got them all settled, she would go to bed at once. Marie was a good girl, and her mother allowed her to remain a little longer with her toys, but fearing lest Marie should be too much occupied with her new doll and other playthings to think of the lights, her mother put all of them out, leaving only the lamp which hung from the ceiling, and which shed a soft light over everything. As soon as Marie was alone, she carefully unbound the ribbon around Nutcracker's head, and examined his wounds.
"Oh, my darling Nutcracker," she said, "I'll take the best care of you, for I am really fond of you. Your teeth shall be put back and your shoulder made right again."
She took him in her arms again, went to the cupboard, and said to her new doll,
"Clara, you will give up your bed to this poor sick wounded Nutcracker, I'm sure?"
Miss Clara, in her Christmas dress, looked very disdainful, but Marie took the bed and moved it forward, laid Nutcracker carefully upon it, and placed them on the upper shelf near the village in which Fritz's hussars were resting. She was about to close the cupboard door when, hark! There began a low, soft rustling and rattling all around, behind the stove, under the chairs, behind the cupboards. The clock on the wall warned louder and louder, but it could not strike. Marie looked at it, and saw that the big gilt owl which was on the top had drooped its wings so that they covered the whole of the clock, and the warning of the clock kept growing louder and louder, with distinct words, "Clock stop ticking, mousy king's ears are fine, purr, purr, only sing, poom, poom, bells go chime, soon rings out the fated time." Marie grew terribly frightened, and was going to rush away as quickly as she could when she noticed that Godfather Drosselmeyer was up on top of the clock instead of the owl.
"Godfather Drosselmeyer!"
she called out as soon as she composed herself.
"What are you doing up there, you naughty, naughty godfather?"
But then there began a strange scampering and squeaking everywhere all about, and presently there was a sound of running and trotting as of thousands of little feet behind the walls, and at the same time thousands of little lights began to glitter out between the chinks of the woodwork. But they were not lights. No, no. Little glittering eyes. And Marie said that everywhere mice were peeping and squeezing themselves out through every chink. Presently they were trotting and galloping in all directions all over the room. Marie was not afraid of mice, and she could not help being amused by this sight. She stood watching the mice come from all directions, when suddenly there came a sharp and terrible piping noise, and 7 mouse heads, with 7 shining crowns upon them, rose through the floor, and behind them wriggled a mouse's body, on which the 7 heads had all grown. Then the whole army of mice shouted in full chorus and went trot, 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 right up to the cupboard. In fact, to Marie, who was standing beside it. Half frightened, Marie leaned back against the cupboard door, and there was a clar, clar, clar. What was happening? Right behind Marie a movement seemed to commence in the cupboard, and small faint voices began to be heard, saying, "Come awake, measures take, out to the fight, out to the fight, shield the right, arm and away, this is the night." And bells began ringing as prettily as you please.
"Oh, that's my little peal of bells,"
cried Marie, and she went nearer and looked in. Then she saw that there was a bright light in the cupboard, and everything there was astir. Dolls and little figures of all kinds were running about together and struggling with their little arms. All at once, Nutcracker rose from his bed, cast off the bedclothes, and sprang with both feet to the floor of the shelf, calling out, "Knick, knack, knack, stupid mousy pack, crick, crack, whack, hew, hick, and hack." And with this he drew his little sword, waved it in the air, and cried, "My trusty followers, are you ready to stand by me in the battle?" Instantly, 3 clowns, 1 pantaloon, 4 chimney sweeps, and a drummer cried, "Yes, yes, we follow you, Nutcracker." And then they threw themselves down from the upper shelf after the brave Nutcracker.
"But what is going to happen now?"
thought Marie. At this moment Nutcracker sprang down, and the squeaking and piping commenced again worse than ever. Under the big table, the mouse army was massed under the command of the terrible Mouse King. What was to be the result? "Beat the generale, drummer!" called out Nutcracker. Immediately the drummer began to roll his drum in the most splendid style, so that the window of the glass cupboard rattled and resounded. Then there began a cracking and a clattering inside, and Marie saw all the lids of the boxes in which Fritz's army was quartered burst open, and the soldiers came out and jumped down to the bottom of the shelf, where they formed up in good order. Nutcracker hurried up and down the ranks, speaking words of encouragement. Then, turning to Pantaloon, who was looking rather pale and wobbling his long chin, he said, "I know you are a brave and experienced general. I entrust you, Pantaloon, with the command of the cavalry and artillery.
You can do without a horse. Your own legs are long and you can gallop as fast as is necessary. Do your duty." Immediately, Pantaloon put his long, lean fingers to his mouth and gave a piercing whistle that rang as if 100 little trumpets had been sounding lustily. Then there began a tramping and neighing in the cupboard, and Fritz's new glittering hussars marched out and came to a halt on the floor. They marched past Nutcracker by regiments, with flags flying and bands playing. Then they wheeled into line and formed at right angles to the march. And now boomed Fritz's cannon with a pum-pum-pum, shooting sugar plums constantly under the mice. Boom, boom again, and a fine fire of gingerbread nuts went into the enemy's ranks, scattering the mice in all directions. Still, the mice displayed continually more forces. Their little silver balls, which they delivered with great precision, went even inside the glass cupboard. You've no idea of the hurly-burly that went on. It went purr, purr, poof, piff, boom, baroom. Pantaloon had made several most brilliant cavalry charges, and covered himself with glory, but Fritz's hussars were pelted by the mice's silver balls, which made bad spots on their red waistcoats. This made them hesitate and hang back for a time. Pantaloon made them take ground to the left, and in the excitement of the moment, they all wheeled round and marched home to their quarters. "The reserves shall come out!" cried Nutcracker, who hoped that more troops would come out from the glass cupboard. And there did, in fact, advance some brown gingerbread men and women, with gilt faces, hats, and helmets, but they fought so clumsily that they never hit any of the mice, and soon knocked off the cap of Nutcracker himself. Poor Nutcracker was now hard pressed and closely surrounded by enemies. He tried to jump the bottom ledge of the cupboard, but his legs were not long enough. "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" At that moment, 2 of the enemies seized him by his wondercloak, and the king of the mice went rushing up to him, squeaking in triumph. Marie could contain herself no longer. "Oh, my poor Nutcracker!" she sobbed. She took off her left shoe, without distinctly knowing what she was about, and threw it as hard as she could into the thick of the enemy, straight at the Mouse King. Instantly, everything vanished, and all was silence. But there stood Nutcracker, with his sword in his hand. He fell upon one knee and said, "It was you, and you only, dearest lady, who inspired me with knightly valour. To you alone I owe my life. If you will take the trouble to follow me for a few steps, what glorious and beautiful things I could show you. Oh, do come with me, dearest lady." "I will go with you, dear Nutcracker," said Marie. "But it mustn't be far, and must not be for long, because, you know, I haven't had any sleep yet." "Then we will go by the shortest way," said Nutcracker, "although it is perhaps the most difficult." He went on in front, followed by Marie, till he stopped before the big old wardrobe which stood in the hall. Marie was surprised to see that, though it was generally shut, the doors of it were now wide open. Her father's fur travelling cloak hung in front. Nutcracker climbed up this cloak by the edgings and trimmings, and got hold of the big tassel which was fastened at the back of it by a thick cord. He gave this tassel a tug, and a pretty little ladder of cedar wood let itself quickly down through one of the armholes of the cloak. "Step up that ladder, if you'll be so kind," said Nutcracker,
Marie did so. But as soon as she had gone up through the armhole and began to look out at the neck, a dazzling light came streaming onto her, and she found herself standing on a lovely, sweet-scented meadow, from which millions of sparks were streaming upward like the glitter of beautiful gems. "This is Candy Meadow, where we are now," said Nutcracker, "but we'll go in at that gate there." Marie looked up and saw a beautiful gateway on the meadow only a few steps off. It seemed to be made of white, brown, and raisin-coloured marble, but when she came close to it, she saw it was all of baked sugar almonds and raisins, which, as Nutcracker said when they were going through it, was the reason it was called Almond and Raisin Gate. Presently, the sweetest of odours came breathing round her, streaming from a beautiful little wood on both sides of the way. There was such a glittering and sparkling among the dark foliage that one could see all the gold and silver fruits hanging on the many-tinted stems, and these stems and branches were all ornamented and dressed up in ribbons and bunches of flowers. "Oh, how charming this is!" cried Marie. "This is Christmas Tree Wood," said Nutcracker. "Ah," said Marie, "if I only could stay for a little. Oh, it is so lovely." Nutcracker clapped his little hands, and immediately there appeared a number of little shepherds and shepherdesses, and hunters and huntresses, so white and delicate that you would have thought they were made of pure sugar, although they had been walking about in the wood. They brought a beautiful golden easy-chair for Marie, and invited her to take a seat. As soon as she did so, the shepherds and shepherdesses danced a pretty ballet, for which the hunters and huntresses played the music on their horns, and then they all disappeared amongst the thickets. "Had we not better go on a little farther?" asked Nutcracker. Marie stood up and followed Nutcracker, who was going on, leading the way. They walked by the side of a sweet babbling brook, which seemed to be what was giving out all the perfume which filled the wood. "This is Orange Brook," said Nutcracker, "but except for its sweet scent, it is nothing like as fine a water as the river Lemonade, a beautiful broad stream which falls, as this one does, into Almond Milk Sea." And indeed, Marie soon heard a louder splashing and rushing, and came in sight of the river Lemonade, which went rolling along in swelling waves of yellowish colour, between banks covered with herbage and underwood. A short distance farther, on the banks of this stream, stood a nice little village. The houses were all dark brown, with gilded roofs so gay that one might suppose that they were plastered over with lemon peel and shelled almonds. "That is Gingerbread Valley, on the Honey River," said Nutcracker. "It is known for the good looks of its people, but they are very short-tempered because they suffer so much from toothache. So we will not go there, nor indeed visit all the little towns and villages or country. Let us be off to the capital." He stepped quickly onwards, and Marie followed him until they came to a great lake which kept broadening and broadening out, wider and wider, and on which the loveliest swans, white as silver with colours of gold, were floating everywhere. Nutcracker clapped his little hands, and the waves of the lake began to sound louder and splash higher, and at once there came a large shell barge made of precious stones of every colour, and drawn by 2 dolphins with scales of gold. It carried her and Nutcracker over the lake. Oh, how beautiful it was when Marie went onward there over the waters in the shell-shaped barge, with the rose perfume breathing around her and the rosy waves splashing. But she could not restrain a cry of admiration and astonishment
as she now found herself all of a sudden before a castle, brightly lighted and splendid, with 100 beautiful towers. Here and there upon its walls were rich bouquets of violets, narcissus, tulips, and carnations. The great dome, as well as the roofs of the towers, were set all over with thousands of sparkling gold and silver stars. "Aha!" said Nutcracker. "Here we are at Marzipan Castle at last." Marie was lost in admiration of this magic palace. The fact did not escape her that the roof was wanting to one of the tallest towers, and that little men upon a scaffold of sticks of cinnamon were busy putting it on again. But before she had time to ask Nutcracker about this, beautiful music was heard, and out came 12 little pages with lighted clove sticks, which they held in their little hands as torches. After them came 4 ladies about the size of Marie's Christmas doll, but so gorgeously and brilliantly dressed that Marie saw in a moment that they could be nothing but princesses. They embraced Nutcracker most tenderly and cried at once, "Oh, dearest prince, beloved brother!" Nutcracker seemed deeply affected. Then he took Marie by the hand and said, "Here is the noble preserver of my life. Had she not thrown her slipper in the nick of time, I should have been captured by the enemy." Then they embraced Marie and said, "Ah, noble preserver of our beloved royal brother, come into the castle and rest yourself, while we prepare some food." Marie and Nutcracker were conducted into the castle, and while the princesses were setting forth a dainty repast, Nutcracker related the adventures of his fight with the Mouse King. He told how everything would have gone against him if Marie had not come to his rescue. During all this time, it seemed to Marie as if what Nutcracker was saying kept growing more and more indistinct, and going farther and farther away. Presently she saw a silver mistiness rising up all about, like clouds in which the princesses, the pages, Nutcracker, and she herself were floating. And a curious singing and buzzing and humming began, which seemed to die away in the distance. And then she seemed to be going up, 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 as if in waves constantly rising and swelling higher and higher, higher and higher and higher. And then came a prrrr, poof, and all was gone. That was a crash and a tumble. However, Marie opened her eyes, and lo and behold, there she was in her own bed. Of course, you see how it was. Marie, confounded and amazed by all the wonderful things she had seen, had fallen asleep at last in Marzipan Castle, and no doubt the princesses themselves had carried her home and put her most gently to bed. It was so terribly cold. Snow was falling, and it was almost dark. Evening came on, the last evening of the year. In the cold and gloom, a poor little girl, bareheaded and barefoot, was walking through the streets. Of course, when she had left her house, she'd had slippers on, but what good had they been? They were very big slippers, way too big for her, for they belonged to her mother. The little girl had lost them running across the road,
where 2 carriages had rattled by terribly fast. One slipper she'd not been able to find again, and a boy had run off with the other, saying he could use it very well as a cradle some day, when he had children of his own. And so the little girl walked on her naked feet, which were quite red and blue with the cold. In an old apron she carried several packages of matches, and she held a box of them in her hand. No one had bought any from her all day long, and no one had given her a cent. Shivering with cold and hunger, she crept along, a picture of misery, poor little girl. The snowflakes fell on her long fair hair, which hung in pretty curls over her neck. In all the windows lights were shining, and there was a wonderful smell of roast goose, for it was New Year's Eve. Yes, she thought of that. In a corner, formed by 2 houses, one of which projected farther out into the street than the other, she sat down and drew up her little feet under her. She was getting colder and colder, but did not dare to go home, for she had sold no matches, nor earned a single cent, and her father would surely beat her. Besides, it was cold at home, for they had nothing over them but a roof through which the wind whistled, even though the biggest cracks had been stuffed with straw and rags. Her hands were almost dead with cold. Oh, how much one little match might warm her! If she could only take one from the box and rub it against the wall and warm her hands. She drew one out. Ratch! How it sputtered and burned! It made a warm, bright flame, like a little candle, as she held her hands over it. But it gave a strange light. It really seemed to the little girl as if she were sitting before a great iron stove, with shining brass knobs and a brass cover. How wonderfully the fire burned! How comfortable it was! The youngster stretched out her feet to warm them too. Then the little flame went out. The stove vanished. She had only the remains of the burnt match in her hand. She struck another match against the wall. It burned brightly, and when the light fell upon the wall it became transparent like a thin veil, and she could see through it into a room. On the table a snow-white cloth was spread, and on it stood a shining dinner service. The roast goose steamed gloriously, stuffed with apples and prunes, and what was still better, the goose jumped down from the dish and waddled along the floor, with a knife and fork in its breast, right over to the little girl. Then the match went out, and she could see only the thick, cold wall. She lighted another match. Then she was sitting under the most beautiful Christmas tree. It was much larger and much more beautiful than the one she had seen last Christmas, through the glass door at the rich merchant's home. Thousands of candles burned on the green branches, and coloured pictures, like those in the print shops, looked down at her. The little girl reached both her hands towards them. Then the match went out. But the Christmas lights mounted higher. She saw them now as bright as stars in the sky. One of them fell down, forming a long line of fire. Now someone is dying, thought the little girl, for her old grandmother, the only person who had loved her, and who was now dead, had told her that when a star fell down, a soul went up to God. She rubbed another match against the wall. It became bright again, and in the glow, the old grandmother stood clear and shining, kind and lovely. "Grandmother," cried the child, "oh, take me with you.
I know you will disappear when the match is burned out. You will vanish like the warm stove, the wonderful roast goose, and the beautiful big Christmas tree." And she quickly struck the whole bundle of matches, for she wished to keep her grandmother with her. And the matches burned with such a glow that it became brighter than daylight. Grandmother had never been so grand and beautiful. She took the little girl in her arms, and both of them flew in brightness and joy above the earth, very, very high, and up there was neither cold, nor hunger, nor fear. They were with God. But in the corner, leaning against the wall, sat the little girl, with red cheeks and smiling mouth, frozen to death on the last evening of the old year. The New Year's sun rose upon a little pathetic figure. The child sat there stiff and cold, holding the matches, of which one bundle was almost burned. She wanted to warm herself, the people said. No one imagined what beautiful things she had seen, and how happily she had gone with her old grandmother into the bright new year. The Elves and the Shoemaker. There was once a shoemaker who worked very hard and was very honest, but still he could not earn enough to live upon, and at last all he had in the world was gone, save just leather enough to make one pair of shoes. Then he cut his leather out, all ready to make up the next day, meaning to rise early in the morning to his work. His conscience was clear, and his heart light amidst all his troubles. So he went peaceably to bed, left all his cares to heaven, and soon fell asleep. In the morning, after he had said his prayers, he sat himself down to his work, when, to his great wonder, there stood the shoes, all ready made, upon the table. The good man knew not what to say or think at such an odd thing happening. He looked at the workmanship. There was not one false stitch in the whole job. All was so neat and true that it was quite a masterpiece. The same day a customer came in, and the shoes suited him so well that he willingly paid a price higher than usual for them, and the poor shoemaker, with the money, bought leather enough to make 2 pairs more. In the evening he cut out the work and went to bed early, that he might get up and begin betimes next day. But he was saved all the trouble, for when he got up in the morning, the work was done ready to his hand. Soon in came buyers, who paid him handsomely for his goods, so that he bought leather enough for 4 pair more. He cut out the work again overnight, and found it done in the morning as before. And so it went on for some time. What was got ready in the evening was always done by daybreak, and the good man soon became thriving and well off again. One evening, about Christmas time,
as he and his wife were sitting over the fire chatting together, he said to her,
"I should like to sit up and watch tonight, that we may see who it is that comes and does my work for me."
The wife liked the thought, so they left a light burning and hid themselves in a corner of the room, behind a curtain that was hung up there, and watched what would happen. As soon as it was midnight, there came in 2 little naked dwarfs, and they sat themselves upon the shoemaker's bench, took up all the work that was cut out, and began to ply with their little fingers, stitching and rapping and tapping away at such a rate that the shoemaker was all wonder, and could not take his eyes off them. And on they went, till the job was quite done, and the shoes stood ready for use upon the table. This was long before daybreak, and then they bustled away as quick as lightning. The next day, the wife said to the shoemaker,
"These little wights have made us rich, and we ought to be thankful to them, and do them a good turn if we can. I am quite sorry to see them run about as they do, and indeed it is not very decent, for they have nothing upon their backs to keep off the cold. I'll tell you what, I will make each of them a shirt, and a coat and a waistcoat, and a pair of pantaloons into the bargain, and do you make each of them a little pair of shoes."
The thought pleased the good cobbler very much, and one evening, when all the things were ready, they laid them on the table, instead of the work that they used to cut out, and then went and hid themselves to watch what the little elves would do. About midnight, in they came, dancing and skipping, hopped round the room, and then went to sit down to their work as usual. But when they saw the clothes lying for them, they laughed and chuckled, and seemed mightily delighted. Then they dressed themselves in the twinkling of an eye, and danced and capered and sprang about as merry as could be, till at last they danced out at the door, and away over the green. The good couple saw them no more, but everything went well with them from that time forward, as long as they lived. Tomten. Deep in the grip of the midwinter cold, stars send a sparkling light. All are asleep on this lonely farm, deep in the winter night. The pale white moon is a wanderer, snow gleams white on pine and fir, snow on the roofs is gleaming. All but the Tomter are dreaming. Grey he stands by the low barn door, grey by the drifted snow, gazing as many winters he's gazed, up at the moon's chill glow. Then at the forest where fir and pine circle the farm in a dusky line, mulling relentlessly a riddle that has no key. Rubs his hand through his beard and hair, shakes his head and his cap. No, that
question is much too deep. I cannot fathom that. Then making his mind up in a hurry, he shrugs away the annoying worry, turns at his own command, turns to the task at hand. Goes to the storehouse and tool shop doors, checking the locks of all, while the cows dream on in the cold moon's light, summer dreams in each stall. And free of harness and whip and rein, even old poor Ler dreams again. The manger he's drowsing over brims with fragrant clover. The Tomten glances at sheep and lambs, cuddled in quiet rest. The chickens are next, where the rooster roosts, high above straw-filled nests. Burrowed in straw, hearty and hale, Carrow wakens and wags his tail, as if to say, "Old friend, partners we are to the end." At last the Tomten tiptoes in to see how the house folk fare. He knows full well the strong esteem they feel for his faithful care. He tiptoes into the children's beds, silently peers at their tousled heads. There is no mistaking his pleasure. These are his greatest treasure. Long generations has he watched, father to son to son, sleeping as babes, but where, he asks, from where have they come? Families came, families went, blossomed and aged, a lifetime spent. Then, where, that riddle again, unanswered in his brain. Slowly he turns to the barnyard loft, his fortress, his home and rest. High in the mow, in the fragrant hay, near to the swallow's nest. The nest is empty, but in the spring, when birds mid leaves and blossoms sing, she for home will be yearning, and with her mate be returning. Then she will talk of the journey tell, twittering to all who hear it, but nary a hint for the question old that stirs in the Tomten's spirit. Now through cracks in the haymow wall, the moon lights Tomten and hay and all, lights his beard through the chinks. The Tomten ponders and thinks. Still is the forest, and all the land, locked in this wintry year. Only the distant waterfall whispers and sighs in his ear. The Tomten listens, and half in dream, thinks that he hears time's endless stream, and wonders, where is it bound? Where is its source to be found? Deep in the grip of the midwinter cold, stars send a sparkling light. All are asleep on this lonely farm, deep in the winter night. The pale white moon is a wanderer. Snow gleams white on pine and fir. Snow on the roofs is gleaming. All but the Tomten are dreaming.
There was once a Velveteen Rabbit, and in the beginning he was really splendid. He was fat and bunchy as a rabbit should be. His coat was spotted brown and white, he had real thread whiskers, and his ears were lined with pink sateen. On Christmas morning, when he sat wedged in the top of the boy's stocking with a sprig of holly between his paws, the effect was charming. There were other things in the stocking, nuts and oranges and a toy engine and chocolate almonds and a clockwork mouse, but the rabbit was quite the best of all. For at least 2 hours the boy loved him, and then aunts and uncles came to dinner, and there was a great rustling of tissue paper and unwrapping of parcels, and in the excitement of looking at all the new presents, the Velveteen Rabbit was forgotten. For a long time he lived in the toy cupboard or on the nursery floor, and no one thought very much about him. He was naturally shy, and being only made of velveteen, some of the more expensive toys quite snubbed him. The mechanical toys were very superior, and looked down upon everyone else. They were full of modern ideas, and pretended they were real. The model boat, who had lived through 2 seasons and lost most of his paint, caught the tone from them and never missed an opportunity of referring to his rigging in technical terms. The rabbit could not claim to be a model of anything, but he didn't know that real rabbits existed. He thought they were all stuffed with sawdust like himself, and he understood that sawdust was quite out of date and should never be mentioned in modern circles. Even Timothy, the jointed wooden lion who was made by the disabled soldiers and should have had broader views, put on airs and pretended he was connected with government. Between them all, the poor little rabbit was made to feel himself very insignificant and commonplace, and the only person who was kind to him at all was the Skin Horse. The Skin Horse had lived longer in the nursery than any of the others. He was so old that his brown coat was bald in patches and showed the seams underneath, and most of the hairs in his tail had been pulled out to string bead necklaces. He was wise, for he had seen a long succession of mechanical toys arrive to boast and swagger, and by break their mainsprings and pass away. And he knew that they were only toys and would never turn into anything else. For nursery magic is very strange and wonderful, and only those playthings that are old and wise and experienced, like the Skin Horse, understand all about it.
"What is real?" asked the rabbit one day, when they were lying side by side near the nursery fender before Nana came to tidy the room. "Does it mean having things that buzz inside you and a stick-out handle?"
"Real isn't how you are made," said the Skin Horse. "It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real."
"Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit.
"Sometimes," said the Skin Horse, for he was always truthful. "When you are real, you don't mind being hurt."
"Does it happen all at once, like being wound up?" he asked. "Or bit by bit?"
"It doesn't happen all at once," said the Skin Horse. "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily or have sharp edges or have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, You can't be ugly. Except to people who don't understand.
I suppose you are real, said the rabbit. And then he wished he had not said it, for he thought the Skin Horse might be sensitive. But the Skin Horse only smiled.
The boy's uncle made me real, he said. That was a great many years ago. But once you are real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always.
The rabbit sighed. He thought it would be a long time before this magic called real happened to him. He longed to become real, to know what it felt like, and yet the idea of growing shabby and losing his eyes and whiskers was rather sad. He wished that he could become it without these uncomfortable things happening to him. There was a person called Nana who ruled the nursery. Sometimes she took no notice of the playthings lying about, and sometimes, for no reason whatever, she went swooping about like a great wind and hustled them away in cupboards. She called this tidying up, and the playthings all hated it, especially the tin ones. The rabbit didn't mind it so much, for whenever he was thrown, he came down soft. One evening, when the boy was going to bed, he couldn't find the china dog that always slept with him. Nana was in a hurry, and it was too much trouble to hunt for china dogs at bedtime, so she simply looked about her, and seeing that the toy cupboard door stood open, she made a swoop.
"Here," she said. "Take your old bunny. He'll do to sleep with you."
And she dragged the rabbit out by one ear and put him into the boy's arms. That night, and for many nights after, the Velveteen Rabbit slept in the boy's bed. At first he found it rather uncomfortable, for the boy hugged him very tight, and sometimes he rolled over on him, and sometimes he pushed him so far under the pillow that the rabbit could scarcely breathe. And he missed, too, those long moonlight hours in the nursery, when all the house was silent, and his talks with the Skin Horse. But very soon he grew to like it, for the boy used to talk to him, and made nice tunnels for him under the bedclothes that he said were like the burrows the real rabbits lived in. And they had splendid games together in whispers when Nana had gone away to her supper and left the nightlight burning on the mantelpiece, and when the boy dropped off to sleep, the rabbit would snuggle down close under his little warm chin and dream, with the boy's hands clasped close round him all night long. And so time went on, and the little rabbit was very happy. So happy that he never noticed how his beautiful velveteen fur was getting shabbier and shabbier, and his tail becoming unsewn, and all the pink rubbed off his nose where the boy had kissed him. Spring came, and they had long days in the garden, for wherever the boy went, the rabbit went too. He had rides in the wheelbarrow, and picnics on the grass, and lovely fairy huts built for him under the raspberry canes behind the flower border. And once, when the boy was called away suddenly to go out to tea, the rabbit was left out on the lawn until long after dusk, and Nana had to come and look for him with the candle because the boy couldn't go to sleep unless he was there. He was wet through with the dew and quite earthy from diving into the burrows the boy had made for him in the flower bed, and Nana grumbled as she rubbed him off with a corner of her apron.
"You must have your old bunny," she said. "Fancy all that fuss for a toy."
The boy sat up in bed and stretched out his hands.
"Give me my bunny,"
he said.
"You mustn't say that. He isn't a toy. He's real."
When the little rabbit heard that, he was happy.
for he knew that what the Skin Horse had said was true at last. The nursery magic had happened to him, and he was a toy no longer. He was real. The boy himself had said it. That night he was almost too happy to sleep, and so much love stirred in his little sawdust heart that it almost burst. And into his boot-button eyes, that had long ago lost their polish, there came a look of wisdom and beauty, so that even Nana noticed it next morning when she picked him up and said, "I declare if that old bunny hasn't got quite a knowing expression." That was a wonderful summer. Near the house where they lived there was a wood, and in the long June evenings the boy liked to go there after tea to play. He took the Velveteen Rabbit with him, and before he wandered off to pick flowers or play at brigands among the trees, he always made the rabbit a little nest somewhere among the bracken, where he would be quite cosy, for he was a kind-hearted little boy, and he liked Bunny to be comfortable. One evening, while the rabbit was lying there alone, watching the ants that ran to and fro between his velveteen paws in the grass, he saw two strange beings creep out of the tall bracken near him. They were rabbits like himself, but quite furry and brand new. They must have been very well made, for their seams didn't show at all, and they changed shape in a queer way when they moved. One minute they were long and thin, and the next minute fat and bunchy, instead of always staying the same like he did. Their feet padded softly on the ground, and they crept quite close to him, twitching their noses, while the rabbit stared hard to see which side the clockwork stuck out, for he knew that people who jump generally have something to wind them up. But he couldn't see it. They were evidently a new kind of rabbit altogether. They stared at him, and the little rabbit stared back, and all the time their noses twitched.
"Why don't you get up and play with us?"
one of them asked.
"I don't feel like it,"
said the rabbit, but he didn't want to explain that he had no clockwork.
"Oh,"
said the furry rabbit,
"it's as easy as anything."
And he gave a big hop sideways and stood on his hind legs.
"I don't believe you can,"
he said.
"I can,"
said the little rabbit.
"I can jump higher than anything."
He meant when the boy threw him, but of course he didn't want to say so.
"Can you hop on your hind legs?"
asked the furry rabbit. That was a dreadful question, for the Velveteen Rabbit had no hind legs at all. The back of him was made all in one piece, like a pincushion. He sat still in the bracken, and hoped the other rabbits wouldn't notice.
"I don't want to,"
he said again. But the wild rabbits have very sharp eyes, and this one stretched out his neck and looked.
"He hasn't got any hind legs,"
he called out.
"Fancy a rabbit without any hind legs!"
And he began to laugh.
"I have!"
cried the little rabbit.
"I have got hind legs. I am sitting on them."
"Then stretch them out and show me. Like this," said the wild rabbit, and he began to whirl round and dance till the little rabbit got quite dizzy.
"I don't like dancing,"
he said.
"I'd rather sit still."
But all the while he was longing to dance, for a funny new tickly feeling ran through him, and he felt he would give anything in the world to be able to jump about like these rabbits did. The strange rabbit stopped dancing and came quite close. He came so close this time that his long whiskers brushed the Velveteen Rabbit's ear. And then he wrinkled his nose suddenly and flattened his ears and jumped backwards.
"He doesn't smell right,"
he exclaimed.
"He isn't a rabbit at all. He isn't real."
"I am real," said the little rabbit. "I am real. The boy said so." And he nearly began to cry.
Just then there was a sound of footsteps, and the boy ran past near them, and with a stamp of feet and a flash of white tails, the two strange rabbits disappeared.
"Come back and play with me,"
called the little rabbit.
"Oh, do come back. I know I am real."
But there was no answer. Only the little ants ran to and fro, and the bracken swayed gently where the two strangers had passed. The Velveteen Rabbit was all alone.
"Oh dear," he thought. "Why did they run away like that? Why couldn't they stop and talk to me?"
For a long time he lay very still, watching the bracken and hoping that they would come back. But they never returned. And presently the sun sank lower, and the little white moths fluttered out, and the boy came and carried him home. Weeks passed, and the little rabbit grew very old and shabby, but the boy loved him just as much. He loved him so hard that he loved all his whiskers off, and the pink lining to his ears turned grey, and his brown spots faded. He even began to lose his shape, and he scarcely looked like a rabbit any more, except to the boy. To him he was always beautiful, and that was all that the little rabbit cared about. He didn't mind how he looked to other people, because the nursery magic had made him real, and when you are real, shabbiness doesn't matter. And then, one day, the boy was ill. His face grew very flushed, and he talked in his sleep, and his little body was so hot that it burned the rabbit when he held him close. Strange people came and went in the nursery, and a light burned all night, and through it all the little Velveteen Rabbit lay there, hidden from sight under the bedclothes. And he never stirred, for he was afraid that if they found him someone might take him away, and he knew that the boy needed him. It was a long, weary time, but the boy was too ill to play, and the little rabbit found it rather dull with nothing to do all day long. But he snuggled down patiently and looked forward to the time when the boy should be well again, and they would go out in the garden amongst the flowers and the butterflies and play splendid games in the raspberry thicket like they used to. All sorts of delightful things he planned, and while the boy lay half asleep, he crept up close to the pillow and whispered them in his ear. And presently the fever turned, and the boy got better. He was able to sit up in bed and look at picture books, while the rabbit cuddled close at his side. And one day they let him get up and dress. It was a bright, sunny morning, and the windows stood wide open. They had carried the boy out on the balcony wrapped in a shawl, and the little rabbit lay tangled up among the bedclothes, thinking. The boy was going to the seaside tomorrow. Everything was arranged, and now it only remained to carry out the doctor's orders. They talked about it all while the little rabbit lay under the bedclothes, with just his head peeping out, and listened. The room was to be disinfected, and all the books and toys that the boy had played with in bed must be burned.
"Hurrah!"
thought the little rabbit.
"Tomorrow we shall go to the seaside."
For the boy had often talked of the seaside, and he wanted very much to see the big waves coming in, and the tiny crabs, and the sand castles. Just then, Nana caught sight of him.
"How about his old bunny?"
she asked.
"That?"
said the doctor.
"Why, it's a mass of scarlet fever germs.
burn it at once. What? Nonsense! Get him a new one. He mustn't have that any more. And so the little rabbit was put into a sack with the old picture books and a lot of rubbish, and carried out to the end of the garden behind the fowl house. That was a fine place to make a bonfire, only the gardener was too busy just then to attend to it. He had the potatoes to dig and the green peas to gather, but next morning he promised to come quite early and burn the lot. That night the boy slept in a different bedroom, and he had a new bunny to sleep with him. It was a splendid bunny, all white plush with real glass eyes. But the boy was too excited to care very much about it. For tomorrow he was going to the seaside, and that in itself was such a wonderful thing that he could think of nothing else. And while the boy was asleep, dreaming of the seaside, the little rabbit lay among the old picture books in the corner behind the fowl house, and he felt very lonely. The sack had been left untied, and so by wriggling a bit he was able to get his head through the opening and look out. He was shivering a little, for he had always been used to sleeping in a proper bed, and by this time his coat had worn so thin and threadbare from hugging that it was no longer any protection to him. Nearby he could see the thicket of raspberry canes, growing tall and close like a tropical jungle, in whose shadow he had played with the boy on bygone mornings. He thought of those long sunlit hours in the garden. How happy they were, and a great sadness came over him. He seemed to see them all pass before him, each more beautiful than the other. The fairy huts in the flower bed, the quiet evenings in the wood when he lay in the bracken, and the little ants ran over his paws. The wonderful day when he first knew that he was real. He thought of the skin horse, so wise and gentle, and all that he had told him. Of what use was it to be loved and lose one's beauty and become real if it all ended like this? And a tear, a real tear, trickled down his little shabby velvet nose and fell to the ground. And then a strange thing happened, for where the tear had fallen, a flower grew out of the ground. A mysterious flower, not at all like any that grew in the garden. It had slender green leaves the colour of emeralds, and in the centre of the leaves a blossom like a golden cup. It was so beautiful that the little rabbit forgot to cry and just lay there watching it. And presently the blossom opened, and out of it there stepped a fairy. She was quite the loveliest fairy in the whole world. Her dress was of pearl and dewdrops, and there were flowers round her neck and in her hair, and her face was like the most perfect flower of all. And she came close to the little rabbit and gathered him up in her arms and kissed him on his velveteen nose that was all damp from crying. "Little rabbit," she said, "don't you know who I am?" The rabbit looked up at her, and it seemed to him that he had seen her face before, but he couldn't think where. "I am the nursery magic fairy," she said. "I take care of all the playthings that the children have loved. When they are old and worn out, and the children don't need them any more, then I come and take them away with me, and turn them into real." "Wasn't I real before?" asked the little rabbit. "You were real to the boy," the fairy said, "because he loved you. Now you shall be real to everyone." And she held the little rabbit close in her arms and flew with him into the wood. It was light now, for the moon had risen. All the forest was beautiful, and the fronds of the bracken shone like frosted silver. In the open glade between the tree trunks, the wild rabbits danced with their shadows on the velvet grass. But when they saw the fairy, they all stopped dancing and stood round in a ring to stare at her.
"I've brought you a new playfellow," the fairy said. "You must be very kind to him and teach him all he needs to know in Rabbit Land, for he is going to live with you for ever and ever." And she kissed the little rabbit again and put him down on the grass. "Run and play, little rabbit," she said. But the little rabbit sat quite still for a moment and never moved. For when he saw all the wild rabbits dancing around him, he suddenly remembered about his hind legs, and he didn't want them to see that he was made all in one piece. He did not know that when the fairy kissed him that last time, she had changed him altogether, and he might have sat there a long time too shy to move, if just then something hadn't tickled his nose, and before he thought what he was doing, he lifted his hind toe to scratch it. And he found that he actually had hind legs. Instead of dingy velveteen, he had brown fur, soft and shiny. His ears twitched by themselves, and his whiskers were so long that they brushed the grass. He gave one leap, and the joy of using those hind legs was so great that he went springing about the turf on them, jumping sideways and whirling round as the others did. And he grew so excited that when at last he did stop to look for the fairy, she had gone. He was a real rabbit at last, at home with the other rabbits. Autumn passed and winter, and in the spring, when the days grew warm and sunny, the boy went out to play in the wood behind the house. And while he was playing, 2 rabbits crept out from the bracken and peeped at him. One of them was brown all over, but the other had strange markings under his fur, as though long ago he had been spotted, and the spots still showed through. And about his little soft nose and his round black eyes there was something familiar, so that the boy thought to himself, "Why, he looks just like my old bunny that was lost when I had scarlet fever." But he never knew that it really was his own bunny, come back to look at the child who had first helped him to be real. The Velveteen Rabbit, or How Toys Become Real, by Marjorie Williams. Read by Stephen Garnett. The Gift of the Magi. $1.87. That was all, and 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied.
3 times Della counted it. $1.87. And the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl. So Della did it, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the home is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home. A furnished flat at $8 per week. It did not exactly beg a description, but it certainly had that word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. In the vestibule below was a letterbox into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. Also appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity, when its possessor was being paid $30 per week. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, the letters of Dillingham looked blurred, as though they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim, and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della. Which is all very good. Della finished her cry, and attended to her cheeks with the powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a grey cat, walking a grey fence in a grey backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She'd been saving every penny she could for months, with this result. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim. Her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him, something fine and rare and sterling, something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honour of being owned by Jim. There was a pier glass between the windows of the room. Perhaps you have seen a pier glass in an $8 flat. A very thin and very agile person may, by observing his reflection in a rapid sequence of longitudinal strips, obtain a fairly accurate conception of his looks. Della, being slender, had mastered the art. Suddenly she whirled from the window and stood before the glass. Her eyes were shining brilliantly, but her face had lost its colour within 20 seconds. Rapidly she pulled down her hair and let it fall to its full length. Now, there were 2 possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hair hang out the window some day to dry just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor, with all his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck at his beard from envy. So now Della's beautiful hair fell about her, rippling and shining like a cascade of brown waters. It reached below her knee and made itself almost a garment for her. And then she did it up again nervously and quickly. Once she faltered for a minute, and stood still while a tear or two splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown jacket, on went her old brown hat. With a whirl of skirts, and with the brilliant sparkles still in her eyes, she fluttered out the door and down the stairs to the street. Where she stopped, the sign read, Madame Sophronie, hair goods of all kinds. One flight up Della ran, and collected herself, panting. Madame, large, too white, chilly, hardly looked the Sophronie.
"Will you buy my hair?"
asked Della. "I buy hair," said Madame. "Take off your hat and let's have a sight at the looks of it." Down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said Madame, lifting the mass with a practised hand.
"Give it to me quick,"
said Della. Oh, and the next 2 hours tripped by on rosy wings. Forget the hashed metaphor. She was ransacking the stores for Jim's present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned all of them inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone, and not by meretricious ornamentation, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was like him, quietness and value. The description applied to both. $21 they took from her for it, and she hurried home with the 87 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly, on account of the old leather strap that he used in place of a chain. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. She got out her curling irons and lighted the gas, and went to work repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love. Which is always a tremendous task, dear friends. A mammoth task. Within 40 minutes her head was covered with tiny, close-lying curls that made her look wonderfully like a truant schoolboy. She looked at her reflection in the mirror long, carefully, and critically. "If Jim doesn't kill me," she said to herself, "before he takes a second look at me, he'll say I look like a Coney Island chorus girl. But what could I do? Oh, what could I do with $1.87? At 7 o'clock, the coffee was made, and the frying pan was on the back of the stove, hot and ready to cook the chops. Jim was never late. Della doubled the fob chain in her hand and sat on the corner of the table near the door that he always entered. Then she heard his step on the stair away down on the first flight, and she turned white for just a moment. She had a habit of saying little silent prayers about the simplest everyday things, and now she whispered, "Please, God, make him think I am still pretty." The door opened, and Jim stepped in and closed it. He looked thin and very serious. Poor fellow, he was only 22, and to be burdened with a family. He needed a new overcoat, and he was without gloves. Jim stopped inside the door, as immovable as a setter at the scent of quail. His eyes were fixed upon Della, and there was an expression in them she could not read, and it terrified her. It was not anger, nor surprise, nor disapproval, nor horror, nor any of the sentiments that she had been prepared for. He simply stared at her fixedly with that peculiar expression on his face. Della wriggled off the table and went for him. "Jim, darling," she cried, "don't look at me that way. I had my hair cut off and sold it because I couldn't have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It'll grow out again. You won't mind, will you? I just had to do it. My hair grows awfully fast. Say Merry Christmas, Jim, and let's be happy. You don't know what a beautiful, nice gift I've got for you." You've cut off your hair? Asked Jim, laboriously, as if he had not arrived at that patent fact yet, even after the hardest mental labour.
Cut it off and sold it, said Della. Don't you like me just as well anyhow? I'm me without my hair, ain't I?
Jim looked about the room curiously. You say your hair is gone, he said, with an air almost of idiocy.
You needn't look for it, said Della. It's sold, I tell you. Sold and gone too. It's Christmas Eve, boy. Be good for me, for it went for you. Maybe the hairs of my head were numbered, she went on with a sudden serious sweetness. But nobody could ever count my love for you. Shall I put the chops on, Jim? Out of his trance, Jim seemed quickly to wake. He enfolded his Della. For 10 seconds, let us regard with discreet scrutiny some inconsequential object in the other direction. $8 a week, or $1 million a year. What is the difference? A mathematician or a wit would give you the wrong answer. The Magi brought valuable gifts, but that was not among them. This dark assertion will be illuminated later on. Jim drew a package from his overcoat pocket and threw it upon the table. Don't make any mistake, Dell, he said, about me. I don't think there's anything in the way of a haircut or a shave or a shampoo that could make me like my girl any less. But if you'll unwrap that package, you may see why you had me going a while at first. White fingers and nimble tore at the string and paper, and then an ecstatic scream of joy, and then, alas, a quick feminine change to hysterical tears and wails, necessitating the immediate employment of all the comforting powers of the lord of the flat. For there lay the combs, the set of combs, side and back, that Della had worshipped for long in a Broadway window. Beautiful combs, pure tortoise shell, with jewelled rims, just the shade to wear in the beautiful vanished hair. They were expensive combs, she knew, and her heart had simply craved and yearned over them without the least hope of possession. And now they were hers, but the tresses that should have adorned the coveted adornments were gone. But she hugged them to her bosom, and at length she was able to look up with dim eyes and a smile and say, "My hair grows so fast, Jim." And then Della leaped up like a singed cat and cried, "Oh! Oh!" Jim had not yet seen his beautiful present. She held it out to him eagerly upon her open palm. The dull, precious metal seemed to flash with a reflection of her bright and ardent spirit. "Isn't it a dandy, Jim? I hunted all over town to find it. You'll have to look at the time 100 times a day now. Give me your watch. I want to see how it looks on it." Instead of obeying, Jim tumbled down on the couch and put his hands under the back of his head and smiled. "Dell," said he, "let's put our Christmas presents away and keep 'em a while. They're too nice to use just at present. I sold the watch to get the money to buy your combs. And now suppose you put the chops on." The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men, who brought gifts to the babe in the manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. Being wise, their gifts were no doubt wise ones, possibly bearing the privilege of exchange in case of duplication. And here I have lamely related to you the uneventful chronicle of two foolish children in a flat, who most unwisely sacrificed for each other
the greatest treasures of their house. But in a last word to the wise of these days, let it be said that of all who give gifts, these two were the wisest. Of all who give and receive gifts, such as they are wisest. Everywhere they are wisest. They are the Magi. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced through their heads. And Mamma in her kerchief, and I in my cap, had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap, when out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave a lustre of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be Saint Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. "Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donder and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all." As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky, so up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with a sleigh full of toys, and Saint Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney Saint Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled! His dimples, how merry! His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him, in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew, like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim, ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night." And that's pretty much all I have left to say to you, my dearest Fox fans. Thank you so much for listening. You take care now, wherever you are, whatever you're up to. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas. I'm sending all my best wishes to you. I hope you have a lovely new year, whatever you decide to get up to, whether you're just keeping it simple and calm, or whether you're having a big party, or whatever. And I'll be back with more stories before you know it. Good day and good night, everyone. Read to you soon.